Chapter 1. Miriam Royal came in from her garden, waving a hand in front of her face, trying to cool off. She was getting too old to spend so much time outside in the summers. Her change of life was upon her, and she wasn't getting any younger. It didn't help that her time outside was spent gardening, which wasn't easy work to start with. Of course, now she had to cook supper during the hottest hours of the day. If only there was a way to keep the air in the house at an even 68 degrees, she would be the happiest woman alive, but everyone knew that wasn't happening. Walking to the ice chest in the corner of the kitchen, she stuck her head right inside, praying it would cool her off at least a little before she turned and started the stew her son had requested for supper. He loved her beef stew, and they'd just butchered a steer a few days before, so it was a good time to make it. Quickly cutting the meat into pieces, she put them in the bottom of her Dutch oven to brown while she peeled the potatoes and the carrots. She hated peeling and growing. She truly wasn't a fan of living in the country if the truth were told, but it made her son so happy to live there. He'd grown up in the city, and she felt she owed it to him to allow him to live where he was happier now. Cameron came in just as she was taking the biscuits out of the oven. He hated when there were no biscuits to go with her stew. "That smells delicious," he said, walking straight to the basin and washing his hands. He knew his mother would thrash him if he didn't, and she didn't seem to care that he was in his 30s. "You need to find a bride," his mother said without preamble. "I can't do everything I could when I was a young wife. It's time you brought one in, and even if she can't cook, I'll train her to be the best wife a man could ask for." Cameron sighed dramatically. "You know, I don't have time to court a woman. Someone has to keep this ranch going, and that someone is me." Cameron had 20 men who worked for him, but he was still in charge, and his finger was in every single piece of the pie that was the Royal River Ranch. "So, if I find you a bride you don't have to court, then you'll marry her?" she asked. Cameron shrugged. He knew very well that women were in short supply in Montana. "Sure, Ma. Whatever you say." Miriam narrowed her eyes at her son. Obviously, he wasn't agreeing with her, but he had acquiesced, and that was good enough for her. She'd contact the mail-order bride agency that had sent out one of the young ladies she'd met when she'd visited the church in Cauldron Valley. She'd gotten the address and name of the owner from Bridget, and she was going to write her a letter. She needed the help, and this was the easiest way to find it. And Cameron had agreed, though she was certain he hadn't meant to. The man barely listened to her. It seemed to be the way of men to never listen to anything their womenfolk had to say. It didn't matter to Miriam though. She now had permission to find herself some help, and Cameron would have a bride, and that meant grandbabies. Asterisk. When Cassandra Arnold stepped out of the home where she worked as a nursemaid for the 2 sons of the wealthiest couple in town, she raised her face to the sky to drink in the sunlight. The Randalls didn't like their children to be out of doors, and quite frankly, Cassandra didn't feel alive unless she was outside. When she'd been a girl, living outside of Beckham, Massachusetts, and going to a country school, she spent most of her time outside, playing in the snow or in the summers, growing her own kitchen garden. Her mother wasn't fond of digging in the dirt, so Cassandra had done it for her, and it had been the best time of her life. Having to stay inside all day to take care of the Randall children felt like it was more than just work, it was a punishment, and one that tortured her as well as just making her uncomfortable. Thankfully, she had Sunday afternoons off after going to church services with the family, and she was going to make the most of it. Perhaps she'd walk out to see her family, but that didn't appeal as much as it should have. What she really wanted to do was remove her socks and shoes and stand in the dirt. Anything less than that, and she wouldn't feel ready to work again. As she walked along Rock Creek Road where the Randalls lived, she passed a woman who had been several grades ahead of her in the country school she'd attended out for a walk with her husband and baby. "Hello, Elizabeth," she said with a smile. She'd always liked Elizabeth, even though her younger siblings had been hellions and had earned themselves the nickname Demon Horde. Elizabeth Tandy grinned at her. "Cassandra." It feels like it's been forever since I've seen you. Aren't you caring for the Randall children? I would expect to see you outside more. Cassandra sighed. Yes, I am, but they don't like the children to spend time outside. They think their time should be spent in more studious pursuits. Thankfully, I have the afternoon off, though all I really want to do is take off my socks and shoes and stand in the dirt. It wasn't something Cassandra would admit to a lot of people, but she knew Elizabeth would understand. I remember you were always getting in trouble at recess because you wouldn't keep your feet dressed, Elizabeth said, laughing. We're just about home. Come and stand barefoot in our back garden for a bit. Back garden? Are there flowers? Yes, there are flowers, and even a small vegetable garden. I would love that. May I weed them for you? Or plant something new? I'm itching to just play in the dirt. Elizabeth laughed. I'm sure there's something to do out there. She led the way into the house and to the parlor where she took the baby out of his pram. I'll show you the garden after I get my little one down for a nap. I'll wait here, if you don't mind, Cassandra said. That would be good. Give me a minute. Elizabeth disappeared from the room, and Cassandra looked out the window at the back garden which awaited her. She truly couldn't wait to dig her hands into the dirt. When Elizabeth came back, she offered, Would you like some lemonade? Or some cookies? I'm sure we have some in the kitchen. Cassandra shook her head. No, I just want to dig. Elizabeth smiled. Why aren't you a Western wife? You could dig in the dirt every day and cook with what you grow. I would love that, but how on earth am I supposed to find a Western man to marry in Massachusetts? You know what I do for a living, don't you? Elizabeth asked. No. I truly don't get out much. I only have one afternoon a week off, and I guard it. I am a matchmaker. I get letters from men, and sometimes women, seeking a life partner. I have a letter from a man I believe would be perfect for you, if you'd like to read it before you dig in the dirt for a while. Cassandra bit her lip. It sounded like the opportunity she needed to change her life, but what was the catch? There had to be something bad that would come out of it. Am I obligated to marry if I read the letter? She finally asked. Of course not. Elizabeth led her to the room across the hall, where a desk was against one wall, and a sofa was perpendicular. Sit down while I find the letter. Cassandra nodded, sitting on the sofa, waiting patiently for Elizabeth to find the letter. She'd had a hard time sitting still her entire life, preferring to move around and do things to sitting quietly. When Elizabeth finally handed her the letter, Cassandra glanced down. The man had beautiful penmanship, if nothing else. June 2, Sup ND/Sup, 1895. Dear potential wife. My name is Cameron Royal, and I live in Mountain Home, Montana. My mother and I live here together on a ranch on the Royal River. We have everything we need, including 20 men who help me work with the cattle. The only thing we don't have is a wife for me, and a mother for my future children. My mother is itching to bounce her grandchild on her knee, and she is getting to an age where she needs help with the gardening and other chores around the house. She is a lovely person and would appreciate the company of another woman on a regular basis. She's even said she's willing to teach you to cook and clean if you do not know how to do those things. I'm a decent-looking man, but there are just not enough women to choose from here in Montana. There are usually 5 or 6 men for every woman, and no one needs that sort of competition when looking for a wife. I hope you will consider my offer. My only real needs in a wife are that she is able to work, and she is young enough to bear children. If you meet both of those qualifications, and you would like to marry me, I would love to have you. Send me a response by a telegraph so that I will be available to fetch you from the train station upon your arrival. I've included money for train fare and for spending money along the way. I do hope you'll agree to be my wife. Sincerely, Cameron Royal. The more she read, the more excited Cassandra became. She liked the idea of marrying a man who would let her play in the dirt, and it sounded like that was one of the main things he needed a wife for. "I want to do it," she said after a minute. "I want to marry Cameron Royal." She liked the way his name felt on her lips as she said it. "How soon can I leave?" Elizabeth laughed. "As soon as the Randalls have someone to take your place, I suppose. I'll talk to them as soon as I finish digging in your dirt. As soon as you have a date when you can leave, I'll get the train fare taken care of and you will be on your way to being Mrs. Royal." Cassandra got to her feet and clapped her hands. "Is it all right if I take my shoes and socks off in here so I don't get mud on my shoes? The Randalls are very particular about whether or not I have mud on my shoes." "That's fine." Elizabeth looked amused. In moments, Cassandra's feet were as bare as the day she was born, and she walked to the back door. "I'll be back." She went to the vegetable garden first. She enjoyed flowers, but they weren't as necessary as the vegetables were. As the daughter of a farmer, she knew how important fruits and vegetables were to people. She carefully weeded between the rows of potatoes, carrots, and cucumbers. Oh, this garden was wonderful, so full of foods that made her happy. Hours later, she did her best to brush the dirt off her dress and her knees. She was covered in it, as she'd expected to be. Thankfully, when she went back into the house, Elizabeth called for a maid to bring her a basin of warm water. "You really did make a mess," Elizabeth said with a laugh. Cassandra grinned. "It was glorious. I pulled so many weeds, and I dug my toes into the dirt. It was exactly what I needed to make my afternoon off perfect. I'm happy to offer my garden any time you need to work in one." "Thank you," Cassandra said. "Hopefully, the Randalls won't mind if I leave soon, and then I won't be forced to bother you again." "You're not bothering me. Usually, Bernard does the gardening here because he finds it relaxing, but often, he's just too busy. So having someone willing to do it is a real blessing." After washing up, Cassandra headed back to the house where she worked and lived, wishing there wasn't so much dirt still on the skirt of her dress. She'd tried to wash it off, but short of a scrub board, she was going to look a mess. Tiptoeing up the back stairs, hoping not to be seen and heard until she could change, she was just about to enter her room when Mrs. Randall walked to her with a disapproving look on her face. "Where have you been, Miss Arnold? You are filthy." "I went to visit a friend, and I helped her with her garden," Cassandra said. Normally she would have immediately apologized and not met Mrs. Randall's eyes, but this time, she had somewhere to go, somewhere she'd rather be. If the woman thought she needed to be fired, she could just do it. Mrs. Randall's eyes narrowed. "Did you not think of the mess you were tracking into my home?" "I brushed it off the best I could, and I gave my feet and legs a thorough washing." Mrs. Randall looked as if she was offended. "You are not fit to care for my children if you don't know to clean yourself before tracking dirt into your employer's home." "I'm sorry you feel that way. I was going to give my notice today anyway. Would you like me to leave immediately or train someone to take my place?" Not that there would be real training to do. The children were forced to spend all their time inside the house playing quiet games or reading. Cassandra didn't know how the beautiful little boys hadn't lost their minds already. "Are you saying you no longer wish to be employed here?" Mrs. Randall looked shocked. "I am. I'm going out west to marry a rancher who needs a wife. He needs me to dig in his dirt." "Well, I never." Cassandra didn't say another word, instead waiting for Mrs. Randall to say whatever she was going to say. She knew the woman was rash in her decisions, and she expected to be let go. "You will pack your things and leave my house immediately. I will not be insulted by a servant in my own home." Cassandra nodded. "I understand. I would like to be paid my wages for the week before I leave." Mrs. Randall turned away, and Cassandra heard her mumble something that sounded like "ungrateful wretch." Hurrying into her room, she packed her things, and Mr. Randall stopped at her open door. "Mrs. Randall has said you're leaving. I'm not sure what we'll do without you." She smiled. "I'm sure everything will be just fine." Mr. Randall had always been a great deal kinder than his wife. He seemed to know she was difficult to deal with. He handed her the week's pay and she left, going straight to Elizabeth's home. There was no doubt in her mind her friend would put her up for a night or two as she got ready to leave on her great adventure. Chapter 2. When Miriam got word that a young lady by the name of Cassandra Arnold was going to be there the 3rd of July, she didn't bother to tell Cameron. No, she could sense that it would be better for everyone if she introduced him when the lady in question arrived. Miriam was excited to not only have someone to help in the garden and around the house, but to have a daughter-in-law, who would someday be the mother of her grandchildren. She could already picture herself in her favorite rocking chair with the baby on her lap. Life would be glorious if she didn't have to work in the garden and she could rock grandbabies. So glorious. On the morning of the 3rd, she asked Cameron to hitch the team up for her. "What do you plan to do?" he asked. "Oh, I'm going to Cauldron Valley for a few hours. I need to go to the Mercantile, and their selection is better than the one in Mountain Home, and I want to call on a friend or two." She would do those things, so she wasn't lying, but truthfully, she was there to pick up her new daughter. Cameron nodded. The request wasn't unusual, as she went into Cauldron Valley a couple times every summer. She had always preferred the shopping there to the shopping in Mountain Home. "I'll see to it," he said, eating the last of his breakfast and pushing the plate away. "I'll go do it now. I need to get to work." Miriam smiled, happy he wouldn't be taking the day off work to drive her. He'd done that a few times when he'd needed to get something in town as well. "What do you want for supper tonight?" she asked. "I'll pick up what we need while I'm there." He thought for a moment. "Nothing in particular, but I'd sure love some cinnamon rolls for breakfast." She wasn't surprised. Cinnamon rolls had always been one of his favorite things. "I'll make it happen. Let the men know." When she made the cinnamon rolls, she always made enough for his men as well. It was a rare treat, and they all looked forward to it. "I will." He got to his feet and grabbed his hat. "Wagon will be ready before you finish the breakfast dishes," he told her, going outside. "Will you be home to cook the noon meal?" Miriam shook her head. "No, I made a few sandwiches and put them in the icebox." "Thanks, Ma." And the door closed behind him. Miriam was glad he was already gone because she was having a hard time keeping her face straight. She was so happy that Cassandra would be there that evening, she was ready to dance a jig. But if she started dancing, Cameron would know that something was happening that he didn't know about. No, it was easier to wait and introduce him to his bride, rather than trying to convince him it was a good thing she'd sent for the young lady. She did the dishes, and then went upstairs to the guest bedroom to make sure it was ready for her new daughter. The bed hadn't ever been made up, but now it held a nice new quilt and pillows she'd gotten from plucking the feathers off of some of her pullets. The previous day, she'd put a vase with a single red rose in it. To her, it was perfect, and she was certain her new daughter would be pleased. Since there was room, and a chaperone, she had readied the spare room. There was no need for them to marry the day sweet Cassandra arrived when they could wait for a few days and have a real wedding. Miriam headed down the stairs and outside to the wagon. Why, she was more excited to meet Cassandra than Cameron was. If he knew she existed, he might be a little more excited, but Miriam knew with everything inside her that it was best that he not know what was happening in advance. When she reached town, she was 30 minutes early for the train, so she headed to the parsonage to visit with Mrs. Cauldron. She enjoyed spending time with the other woman, and she had told Cameron she would go visiting. When Mrs. Cauldron came to the door, she threw it wide, smiling. "My daughter-in-law is here with 2 of my grandsons. You must join us." "I'd love to." I only have a few minutes to visit, but I'd love to see the boys. Miriam stepped into the house and followed Mrs. Cauldron into the parlor, where her daughter-in-law was trying to convince her sons not to try to climb the curtains. You know we can't visit Grandma if you keep breaking her things. Mrs. Cauldron laughed softly. Nonsense. Grandma raised 2 boys just like them. Of course they're breaking things. It's a Cauldron boy's way. Miriam thought for a moment about how her husband would have reacted to Cameron misbehaving the way the twins were, and she knew it was a good thing he hadn't been anything like these boys. After a nice visit, cut short by the need to go and fetch Cassandra, Miriam said goodbye to her friend and to the younger Mrs. Cauldron, whom Miriam didn't envy one bit. It was hard enough to be a young mother, but to be a young mother of twin boys who were the worst hellions around? The poor girl. She drove the wagon to the train station, and sat watching until the train pulled into the tiny station. Cauldron Valley was just a whistle stop, and the train wouldn't be there for long. When 2 passengers got off the train, she immediately knew it was the first person she was looking for, as the second person was a man, who looked to be hoping for ranch work. She got down from the wagon and walked over to the young lady who seemed to be looking around her nervously. Cassandra Arnold? The woman smiled, holding out her hand. Yes. Are you Mrs. Royal? I am. It's so good to meet you. Miriam ignored the hand and pulled the girl in for a hearty embrace. If you're going to be my daughter, you'll call me Ma, like Cameron does, or Miriam. We're not standing on formality. She hated to be called Mrs. Royal because the name was, well, it wasn't her married name. Didn't Cameron come? Cassandra asked, looking around once more. No, he had to work today, so I offered to come and fetch you, Miriam fibbed. She'd have to tell both of them the truth within a few short hours, but it was better if she waited until she was home. I see. Cassandra wasn't bothered. She understood needing to work very well. Well, thank you for coming to fetch me. I've been sitting for so long, I was starting to think I was becoming part of that train. She'd gotten up to move at every stop along the way, but it wasn't the same as being allowed to roam. I can certainly understand that. I felt the same when we came west 10 years ago. Are we going straight to the ranch? Cassandra asked. She couldn't wait to get there and be able to spend time outdoors. She hoped the garden was in a terrible state, simply so she could spend the time weeding it and maybe even planting a few more things. I need to stop at the Mercantile first, if that's all right. I'm almost out of flour and brown sugar, and Cameron would like cinnamon rolls for him and his men tomorrow. I think it will be a great way to start the 4th of July, don't you? I do. Is there a fireworks display close? Cassandra had always loved watching the fireworks. There is one in Mountain Home, which is the town closest to us. We always go. Independence Day is really special here, Miriam said. Do you have a trunk? Or just your bags? Just the 2 bags. I was a nursemaid back home, and I didn't have a lot of possessions. I hope it won't make you think less of me. Oh, not at all. I don't care what you used to do. I care about who you are now. And soon, you'll be a royal. Miriam led Cassandra to her wagon, and climbed up to pick up the leads. When Cassandra had stowed her bags and gotten in beside her, Miriam said, The Mercantile is just a short way, but we won't want to have to carry that flour to the wagon. I agree. Usually, it would be no problem for me, but after so long on the train, I feel weak. I hate feeling weak. I felt the same way after our trip out here. Did you and your husband come out along with Cameron? Cassandra asked, feeling like she was almost begging for some history of the family. Miriam shook her head. My husband died back in New York City, where Cameron was born and raised. When Miriam didn't offer more information, Cassandra let the subject drop. I was raised on a farm outside of Beckham, Massachusetts, and I spent every minute I could working on my mother's kitchen garden. I loved every second of the work, and I have missed it terribly. The family I worked for wouldn't allow me to take the children outside, so I could only spend time outdoors on Sunday afternoons. I was so excited to learn that you needed help in your garden. Cameron told me in the letter he sent. That's nice, dear. Miriam stopped the wagon and climbed down. It wasn't as easy getting in and out of the conveyance now that she was getting older. The two women went into the mercantile, and they chose what they needed. The merchant's son carried their purchases to the wagon. You didn't need to purchase fabric for me to have a new dress. I brought a Sunday dress and 2-day dresses. Cassandra had never had 3 dresses until the past year. She was proud that she had so many. Oh, you'll need more than that, Miriam said, smiling. Especially if you plan to dig in the dirt. Just as often as possible. Cassandra said with a smile. I find it a little difficult to breathe here. I did upon my arrival as well. The feeling will be gone within a week or 2. The doctor I consulted said it was the altitude that was making me feel poorly. Well, then I won't bother to consult one. I'll know it will go away soon. Cassandra watched the scenery as they drove to the east. At least she thought it was to the east. It was a little hard to be certain. We'll measure you for your new dress today, and then you can turn one of your older day dresses into a gardening dress. It'll be nice to have one you don't mind getting dirty. Cassandra laughed. I don't mind much if I get anything dirty. She shrugged. I love being outside too much to care. Miriam smiled. Well, that pleases me, because gardening is my most dreaded task. I do as much as I need to do to look like I'm working. You won't have to worry about that anymore. I don't know how to can vegetables, unfortunately, so if you can teach me that, I can take care of the garden and even the canning. I don't mind canning, but I will teach you how. A good frontierswoman needs to know how to can. Yes, she does, Cassandra said. I'm excited to learn to be a good frontierswoman. Can you teach me to shoot? She loved the idea of knowing how to shoot. I don't shoot, but I believe Cameron would be happy to teach you. The faraway look in Miriam's eyes when she said that told Cassandra there was more to the story. She hoped her future husband was more open about things than his mother was. When they reached the ranch, Cassandra took her bags from the wagon to carry inside. I'll come back for the supplies, she told Miriam. I don't mind carrying them in. What a good daughter you'll be, Miriam said as she opened the front door. Inside the house, Cassandra saw a man standing. You must be Cameron. I'm happy to meet you. I'm Cassandra. When the man just looked at her blankly. The bride you sent for? Are you not Cameron? I'm Cameron, but I have no idea who you are. He stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Miriam smiled. Remember when you told me to find you a wife? She asked. Well, here she is. Cameron's eyes narrowed, and it was obvious to Cassandra he was angry. That's a bunch of malarkey, Mother. You know I wasn't telling you to send for a bride. Without another word, he strode from the house, and left Cassandra staring after him, wondering what she'd done wrong. If he didn't want to marry her, then she would need to find someone else or go back to Beckham, and she was determined not to go home. No, she was in Montana to stay. It was too beautiful for her to even consider leaving. When Miriam turned to her, she could see sadness in the older woman's eyes. He'll come around, she promised. Cassandra sighed. You sent the letter? Yes. And I received the telegram as well. He needs a wife, and he agrees he needs a wife, but he told me that none of the women in Montana he'd tried to court were acceptable. So I said for you. What should we do now? Miriam smiled. We measure you for the dress and we fix supper. I'll show you your room. I got it ready for you because I thought you and Cameron might want a few days to get to know one another before you made your vows. Cassandra took a deep breath and was once again startled when she felt like she couldn't breathe deeply enough. "I'll follow your lead, Mrs. Royal." Miriam frowned. "I thought we'd decided you'd call me Ma or Miriam. Not if we might not be related soon. It would be too informal." Cassandra felt as if her heart was breaking when she didn't even know the man. But oh, the thoughts she'd had about him. She wasn't a bunch of malarkey, and that's all there was to it. Chapter 3. Cassandra wasn't even sure she should let Miriam show her to the room she'd gotten ready for her, but she finally acquiesced. The older woman still needed help around the ranch, and it was the right thing to do. Besides, Cassandra owed Miriam. Her train ticket had been paid for, and there was no way she could avoid paying the older woman back somehow. Her parents had raised her right. Cassandra found her room delightful. "It's perfect. Cozy, warm, and so homey. I'll only stay long enough to pay back the cost of my fare and the money you sent for my expenses on the trip out." Unfortunately, she'd spent most of the money on food along the way. It was surprisingly expensive to eat on a train. "You'll do no such thing. You left your job to come here, and you have to give Cameron a chance to change his mind." "I know he will. You're a lovely young lady." Cassandra had found Cameron extremely attractive, but she couldn't say that to his mother. Instead, she put her things down on the chest of drawers and asked, "What should I do first?" "Rest," Miriam said. "You just arrived, and you must be exhausted." Cassandra shook her head. "No, I need to move around." "Could your garden use weeding? Or I could plant something? Anything to harvest yet?" Miriam just smiled. "You're going to be a good daughter-in-law. I think you know as well as I do that's not happening. Your son made it clear he doesn't want me here. He just doesn't know you yet. Once he gets to know you, he'll realize you're meant for him." Cassandra frowned. "And you already know that?" "I believe I do." "We'll see," was all Cassandra could say. "Now, put me to work." Miriam smiled. "I have a large kitchen garden, and my most hated chore is taking care of it. It desperately needs to be weeded, and someone needs to water it, but carrying a bucket of water to each plant takes so much effort." Cassandra smiled. "You just show me this garden and where to find the water, and I'll get to work." She looked down at her dress. "I do wish I could wear trousers to garden. I think someday women will be wearing trousers all the time, and I am going to impatiently wait for it. I should make you a split skirt to garden in." "I wouldn't be seen as a loose woman in a split skirt." "Absolutely not. You need one, and that's all there is to it." Miriam shrugged. "Besides, you don't need to try and impress Cameron. He's made it clear he has better things to do than to court you or marry you." Cassandra chuckled softly. "You're right. He has. I would love a split skirt, but for today, I'm putting on my oldest day dress and then getting to work. I can't wait." She didn't mention that her oldest dress had a few visible patches. She'd only brought it along for scraps, but now she was going to wear it. Who was going to care? As soon as Miriam shut the door behind her, Cassandra changed dresses. Her mother would be scandalized if she realized Cassandra was wearing it where unmarried men could see her, but she couldn't be bothered by that. As soon as she was finished, she found Miriam, who gave her the bucket she used for watering, showed her where the hoe and spade were, and pointed the way to the well. That was good enough for Cassandra. She filled the huge bucket with water and carried it to the edge of the garden before taking the hoe and starting to dig up the weeds she found. She believed in doing everything the right way, so she made certain she dug all the way down to the root of each weed. After an hour outside, she wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist, wishing she'd thought to wear a bonnet or some sort of hat. The sun was in her eyes as she worked. She'd just started watering each plant when two men on horses stopped beside the garden. One of them smiled at her. "And who might you be?" I'm Cassandra Arnold. I'm here to help Mrs. Royal with her garden and other household tasks. She didn't bother to tell them she had come as a mail-order bride, because what was the point? It was none of their business anyway. I see, the man who had asked the question said. Do you have plans to go to the 4th of July picnic and fireworks show tomorrow evening? It's at the church in town, and I'd be happy to be your escort. Cassandra smiled at him. I'm sorry, but I promised I'd go with Mrs. Royal. Perhaps you could escort me to another event soon. You can count on it, he said. I'm Wade Kelso, and I'm the foreman here at Royal River Ranch. Welcome. Thank you, she said sweetly. I'll look forward to getting to know you better. As the two men rode away, she heard the one who had remained silent ask Wade, You sure the boss don't have his eye on her? If he did, I think she would have told me, or he would have mentioned her arrival, don't you think? Cassandra smiled. Perhaps she wouldn't have to earn her fare back to Massachusetts after all. She could meet someone and stay. Maybe she'd meet the man of her dreams at the picnic. She'd just finished up watering every plant in the huge garden when Mr. Royal rode up to her. I see you're at least earning your keep. Cassandra straightened her back and glared at the man. There's no reason for you to be angry with me. I'm a victim of false pretenses, the same as you are. Cameron watched her for a moment before nodding. I guess you are. All right. He didn't apologize, but instead rode off to the stable, or a building she assumed was the stable, and put his gelding away. After staring after him for a moment, she returned to her work. The longer she took, the more chance she gave mother and son to talk about the situation and decide what to do. She returned all the garden tools to the spot in the small shed Mrs. Royal had shown her. Brushing her hands off, she slowly walked toward the house. She didn't want to hear a discussion about her needing to go back where she came from. When she opened the door and stepped inside, she could see that Miriam was putting supper on the table. It was hard to call the older woman Mrs. Royal even in her mind. She was so friendly, Cassandra already felt like they were friends. Miriam looked at her and laughed. You weren't joking when you said you loved digging in the dirt. You are a mess, child. Your garden is beautiful. I truly enjoyed working in it. Is there time for me to wash up a bit and change before supper? Cassandra did her best not to be embarrassed by the state of her appearance. It wasn't as if someone who mattered could see her. Absolutely. I'll give you a pitcher, and you can fill the bowl in your room and clean up in there. Thank you so much. Cassandra gratefully accepted the pitcher and took it upstairs to her room, where she stripped down to nothing and put on all new clothing including her underthings. Everything was covered in dirt, and she had to giggle just a little. She was a mess, and she wasn't even ashamed of it. She took her hair down out of the bun it had been in when she arrived, though little of her blonde hair remained up. Instead of fussing with it, she brushed it out and let it hang down her back. It looked better that way anyway, and her mother wasn't there to tell her she looked like a loose woman. She hurried down the stairs to the kitchen where she unfortunately overheard a bit of talk about herself. Give the girl a chance, Cameron. She's feisty and sweet and the type of woman I would love to have for a daughter-in-law. Then I hope you have another son around. I will not marry someone who my mother found for me. Why not? I'm not controlled by what's in the front of your pants, and I'm sure I'll make a better decision than you will. Miriam sounded downright cross to Cassandra. Is that so? He asked. Very much so. The last two girls you courted were dumber than a lamppost, and I know they weren't worthy of being royals. Royal isn't even our real name, so how can you act like you have this family heritage that matters to you so much? Cassandra frowned. Why don't they use their real name? Doesn't matter whether we took our name from the river or not. We now have a royal heritage. He scoffed. You're just being silly now, Ma. I refuse to believe I'm anything but a royal. Everything that happened in Manhattan needs to stay right where it is. There, not here. We've made a new life together, and a bride would simply make everything complete. He sighed. I'll talk to her. Spend a little time with her. But if I'm not as enamored of her as you are, I'm putting her on a train right back where she came from. All right, Mrs. Royal said. Cassandra waited another minute before going into the kitchen to join them. What can I do to help with supper? She asked, keeping her voice cheery. They didn't need to know she'd overheard their conversation. You've done enough work today, dear, Mrs. Royal said with a smile. You just sit down and let me bring you a plate. I shouldn't have let you work on the garden after being cooped up in the train for so long, and I'm angry with myself for letting you talk me into it. I think if you hadn't let me work in the garden, I may have needed to be sent to an asylum. I needed to reconnect with the earth after so many days in a man-made contraption. I bet you loved working with the children, Miriam said. I hope you didn't spend every day with them playing in the dirt. Cassandra shook her head, taking a seat at the table as far from Cameron as she could. My former employers wouldn't allow me to take the children outside. They felt it was best for them to stay indoors and concentrate on scholarly pursuits. I only had one afternoon off per week, so my dirt time has been very limited. I can see that. After putting the food on the table, Mrs. Royal took a seat at the opposite end from Cameron. I'll say the blessing tonight. Cassandra almost giggled twice during the prayer while Mrs. Royal went on and on about how thankful she was that Cassandra had arrived safely and was such a pretty young thing, perfect for bearing her grandchildren. When it seemed like the woman would go on forever, Cameron interrupted. Amen. Mrs. Royal glared at her son. I wasn't to that part yet, she said, dishing up her food onto her plate. You should have been. Cassandra enjoyed watching the two of them banter. It seemed so nice that they treated one another as equals for the most part. After everyone's plates had been filled, Cameron looked at Cassandra. Where are you from? A town about an hour train's ride south of Boston. Beckham, Massachusetts. For a moment, she thought about the people who she missed back home, but she didn't mention them. She'd only respond when he asked a question. What made you decide to come west and marry a stranger? He asked. A friend of mine realized that I needed to be a Western wife. At least that's what she told me, and then she showed me your letter. Well, I suppose it was your mother's letter, but I believed it to be yours. That letter made me feel that this was the perfect place for me. She took a sip of water. I still think this is the right place for me. I just might need to meet a man who wants a wife. He sighed. You are a shock to me. I think you can understand that. I wasn't expecting my mother to go to town in the morning and come home in the afternoon with a bride for me in tow. For now, why don't you continue to help Ma around the house, and perhaps we can spend some time together in the evenings. This part of Montana is beautiful, and I'd love to take drives with you or even walk with you. She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. I don't think we could do that. I'll make sure to earn my keep. Ma needs the help, but I have a feeling you enjoy gardening as much as she hates it. It'll be a good arrangement for you both. It would be better if there was a grandbaby involved, Mrs. Royal insisted. Cassandra bit her lip, trying to keep her laughter inside. When the laughter won out, the others looked at her, a bit startled. But it wasn't long before all three of them were laughing. The situation was ridiculous, but it could grow into something truly special. I'm glad you see the humor in the situation, Cameron said. I felt like a fool standing there trying to talk to a stranger who had come here to be my wife. Perhaps if I'd had a day or two notice, it would have helped. Oh, pish-posh. You would have just told me to leave her at the train station. Besides, it doesn't matter anymore if you marry her or not. I've decided to adopt her as my own, and her children will be my grandchildren regardless. I don't think I want them to be related to us by blood anyway. Cassandra looked between the two of them for a moment, wondering what huge secret they were keeping between them. It was something, and she was sure it wasn't a good secret. Soon, she would know the truth. Chapter 4. After supper, Cassandra helped with the dishes, but then she immediately went outside to work on the garden. Next year, if she was still around, she'd extend it and add more vegetables, and maybe even some raspberries. She loved raspberries, and she had a feeling Mrs. Royal could turn them into wonderful pies and jams. She was on her knees in the garden, making a larger mound of dirt over a couple of the plants that she didn't think were buried deep enough when Cameron came out of the house and stood outside the garden watching her for a moment. She wanted to say, "Go away," but she was a guest in his house, and rudeness would be retaliated against, she was certain. "Would you like to walk with me?" he asked. "The sun won't set for a couple of hours yet, and it would please my mother a great deal." Cassandra sighed. "I'd have told you to go away if you hadn't mentioned your mother. She's been kind to me, and I don't want to disappoint her in any way." He cocked his head to one side. "And I've been the opposite of kind." "Yes, you have." She shrugged. "I'm sure it was a shock to come home and find a woman you had no idea existed living in your home, intending to marry you." His lips twitched. "Did you know she hadn't told me?" She shook her head. "I would have refused to go home with her if she had. But I'm here, and I don't know what to do, so I'll stay until I can find another place to be." He frowned. "So, you're not even willing to consider marrying me?" "You're not willing to consider marrying me." She brushed off the front of her skirt. "Let's walk." Cameron frowned at her. "I'm sorry I was so rude to you earlier. Trust me, people have been much ruder to me. Will your parents mind if you come back?" She laughed. "I have 10 younger siblings. I'm the oldest, and they are all still at home. I was working in town near where I grew up." "You grew up in the country?" Cassandra nodded, wondering why he was asking her all these questions. It didn't make sense to her. "I did. On a farm. And I've missed country living every day since I left my parents' house. But I won't return." "What do you plan to do then?" he asked. "I'll do as much work as I can around your ranch to earn my keep until I find somewhere else. I'm sure there's someone around who needs someone to care for their children or work in their gardens. Maybe without pay, but I won't be your burden for long." She moved her head back to look straight up at the sky. "Besides, your mother and I are going to a 4th of July celebration in town tomorrow. I'm sure she can introduce me to some eligible men." He frowned. "So, you won't marry me, but you'll marry some stranger?" That didn't seem right. "You're a stranger as well." "I'll marry someone your mother approves of." Cameron was suddenly jealous. He didn't know why, and he knew it made no sense at all. "You can't marry someone else. I paid for you to come out here." Cassandra stopped walking and glared at him. "So, I'm intruding on your life, but I'm also not allowed to marry someone else?" She poked him in the chest. "What exactly do you think I should do then?" "I don't know. I still don't know why Ma thought it was all right for her to send for you." She shook her head. "You make me so angry, I just want to kick you." "Don't," he said softly, watching her. He couldn't believe how much fire she had inside her. She looked to make certain they were well away from the house. "I was just as shocked as you were that I wasn't here to marry you. It's my life that's been upended. I'm the one who just sat in a train car all the way across this great nation of ours. My backside hurts from all that travel. You will stop acting as if I'm intruding on your life." He couldn't help but laugh. She had so much fire, but she was so much smaller than him. Her anger was simply amusing. "Is that so?" "It is." She shook her head. "No wonder you're not married. You're not fit for a woman to walk on, let alone kiss." She turned away from him to head back to the house. His mother should have seen that they walked together. Now she'd get back to her gardening, her duty complete. He caught her shoulder, spinning her back toward him. With your anger problems, it's no surprise that you aren't married. No man would put up with that. She raised her hand to slap him, but he caught it in his hand. Let go of me, you brute. Instead of letting her go, Cameron lowered his lips to hers and kissed the anger right off her lips. He held her there, and while she expected his kiss to be punishing, it was soft and gentle. It didn't take long at all for her to melt against him and return his kiss. He was still holding one of her hands, but Cassandra moved the other to his shoulder, hanging on to him for dear life. When he raised his head, he looked just as stunned as she felt. I guess I'm fit to kiss after all. Cassandra had nothing to say to that, so she pulled her hand from his grip and headed back toward the house. The man was insufferable, and she had no desire to spend even another minute in his company. She went to the garden and knelt in the same spot she'd been in, and she worked, but her mind was no longer focused on the vegetables in the garden. No, she was too busy thinking about how much she enjoyed kissing him. Never having been kissed before, she didn't know if it was normal to like it that much, but perhaps she was a loose woman who enjoyed kissing every man who came along. She'd never had the opportunity to know any differently. When she heard footsteps approach, she didn't even turn to acknowledge him. Instead, she kept working, her head down. Good to see you again, a man's voice said. Cassandra turned to see the same man who had come by earlier. Oh, hello. Wade watched her for a moment. You really enjoy working in the garden, don't you? I do. I'm a farmer's daughter, and I'm proud of it. He grinned. Would you like to go for a walk with me? She took a deep breath. Why not? She needed to find out if she was compatible with the man anyway, and he was a great deal nicer than Cameron was. I'd like that. Let's not go that way, though, she said, pointing in the direction Cameron had taken her. Wade shrugged. That's all right. I'll walk whichever direction you'd like, he said, offering a hand to help her to her feet. You don't want to touch me. I'm filthy from my time in the garden. Oh, that doesn't bother me a bit, Miss Arnold. She took his hand and he pulled her to her feet. She liked this man. Instead of walking further onto the ranch, he led her toward the road. How long have you worked for Mr. Royal? 8 years now. I was his first hand when he started this operation. He walked along beside her, but didn't crowd her the way some men had. So, you've known him for a very long time. I really enjoy being around Mrs. Royal. She's very kind. She is, but she's also a bit of a meddler. Cassandra bit her lip, but she decided to confess her situation. She liked Wade, and maybe if he knew what was happening, he would be interested in more than just walking with her in the evening. She sent for a mail-order bride on Mr. Royal's behalf. He came home for a bit today, and he had no idea who I was. Now I'm just helping out in the garden and around the house. He has no desire to marry me. He's made that abundantly clear. Then he's not as smart as I've given him credit for. Wade shook his head. If you're looking for a man to step into his shoes and marry you, don't look any further. Please. Cassandra laughed. I'm going to think long and hard before I agree to marry someone else. I'm in a good place, and I don't have to hurry anything. Well, know that I'll wait as long as you feel the need to wait. She wanted to ask him to kiss her, so she could see if she just liked kisses or if there was something special about Cameron's, but she didn't dare. Maybe eventually. He stopped at the side of the road and picked a flower for her. She took it and sniffed deeply. Thank you. Is it a cornflower? It is. You know your flowers. Cassandra smiled. I do. If I haven't physically seen one, then I've seen pictures in books. I've read more gardening books than any woman should ever admit to. I prefer fruit and vegetable gardens because they provide food, but I love flowers as well. You read? He asked, looking surprised. She nodded. Yes, I went to school all the way through 8th grade. She'd have gone longer, but it was the highest grade her school had offered. I had no idea. I think that's wonderful. You don't? She asked. She didn't mind if he couldn't, but it would be good to know. He shook his head. I never had the opportunity to learn. Would you like me to teach you? She asked. She was more than willing. I don't know, what if I'm not smart enough to learn? You are. I promise. They turned on the road then and headed back toward the house. She was glad because exhaustion was setting in. Why don't we plan to work together after supper in the evenings? I'll sit with you and teach you your letters and the sounds they make. They're my letters? Why aren't they your letters? Cassandra laughed. I think I like you. I know I like you. And I'll take you up on your offer. I'll be at the house every evening after supper. He grinned. I might sweet-talk Mrs. Royal into a supper invite for every night as well. I think that's a great idea, she said. Then we could spend more time together getting to know one another. When they reached the house, he smiled at her, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. Thank you for the lovely walk and the sweet offer, he said. I won't come for reading lessons tomorrow, with it being the 4th and all, but I'll come the next evening, if you'll have me. I would enjoy it a great deal. I'll talk to Mrs. Royal about it. And I hope you'll save me a dance at the 4th of July picnic and fireworks. There will be dancing? She asked. I've never really learned to dance. I went to a few dances back home, but I always stood in the corner and watched. Wade sighed. A woman as beautiful as you should never be a wallflower. With a wave, he turned away, and she wondered where the man slept. Was there a bunkhouse or something? She'd have to ask Mrs. Royal. When she went inside, she saw that Cameron and his mother were sitting at the table. Who were you with? Mrs. Royal asked, a sly smile on her face. Cassandra shrugged. Wade asked me for a walk, and I accepted. He seems like a very nice man. Oh, he is, dear. He'd make you a wonderful husband. I was thinking along the same lines, Cassandra agreed. How would you feel if he started coming over in the evenings after supper? I want to teach him to read, and he's agreed. Of course, he has, Cameron muttered. Man's not a fool. No, he didn't seem to be a fool at all, Cassandra said with a smile. If you don't mind, I'll be off to bed. I haven't slept lying down in over a week, and I'm very excited at the prospect. It's funny, the things that you don't think you'll miss are the first things you want back. I will never take sleeping in a real bed for granted again. Good, Mrs. Royal said. Sleep well. If you need anything, feel free to just look for it. Thank you. Good night. As she hurried up the stairs, Cassandra found herself humming happily to herself. As she went into her room, she glanced in the small mirror above the washbowl, and she giggled. She was a mess. Her hair was going in every direction, and she had dirt smeared across her nose. Her mother would have a fit if she knew she'd walked with 2 men in one evening with dirt on her nose. She was happy to be in the West though, because her penchant for dirt didn't seem to bother anyone. She set her cornflower on the dresser provided, and she smiled at it once more. She'd never imagined a man would want to court her with flowers and gifts. The men she'd known just wanted her help planting flowers for the girls they liked, who of course hadn't been her. Why would they like her? As soon as school was out every day, she'd walked home barefoot, as long as the weather was fine. She would then be covered with dirt up to her knees, and the boys would laugh at her, but she'd never minded. And here? No one seemed to mind. She should be able to find a husband who would love her for who she was. She needed to sit down and write Elizabeth Tandy immediately, so Elizabeth would know how well she fit in. She changed into her nightgown and fell into the bed that was so prettily made. It was a little too Well, feminine for Cassandra's taste, but it was a place to sleep, and that's all she cared about at the moment. She prayed to thank God for getting her to her destination safely, and that there was a place on earth for women like her. Women who didn't fit into the mold all men seemed to want to cram women into. Instead, she was her own person, an original if you will. And she was somewhere that she would be respected for that. She wasn't able to stay awake long enough to continue her prayer. Instead, her mind kept drifting away, and she finally fell asleep in the middle of it.